Who or what inspired Bram Stoker to create his infamous vampire? Was it the folklore of southeastern Europe, the vampire panic of New England, or something closer to reality? Was Dracula an actual living, breathing person who once walked the earth and left a wake of terror wherever he went? This is the No Fear Podcast. We know what scares you.
I'm Matt.
I'm Mel.
And I'm Lisa.
And this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is Season 2, Episode 19. This is our continuation of an ongoing series on vampires. Last episode, we heard from a relative of Bram Stoker, the man who created Dracula. And today, we are joined by Paul Jannise, who is helping us look at one potential inspiration for Dracula, a man from Hungarian history known as Vlad Dracula, or Vlad the Impaler. We know that there are many ideas behind who or what may have inspired Stoker when writing his novel. This episode is intended to disentangle fact from fiction. We will explore other potential inspirations, like Elizabeth Bathory, for our Patreon supporters.
What is your general idea of who Vlad the Impaler is before I start mentioning stuff?
Well, as I told you when we were kind of texting back and forth preparing for this thing, I know that he is mentioned in a song by Guar and that he is the inspiration for Dracula, and that's about as far as I go. But Mel, Lisa, do you know any more than that?
Impaling comes to mind.
Yeah, well, that was his favorite method of killing people, and he killed a lot of people. The book I most rely on for my research is The Many Faces of Dracula, which is still kind of the most accessible popular history that's published on the subject that's credible. And a quote from it said, he killed victims including people of all nationalities, Romanians from Moldavia, Wallachia, and Transylvania, plus Bulgarians, Germans, Hungarians, and Gypsies, all classes, boyars as well as peasants, all religions, Catholic, Muslim, Orthodox, Jewish, and men, women, and children. And let's see, he decapitated, cut off noses, ears, sexual organs, and limbs. He blinded, strangled, hanged, burned, boiled, skinned, roasted, hacked, nailed, buried alive, and had his victims stabbed. He also made use of the wheel, hot irons, and other forms of torture. So he was like your all-round crazy medievalist.
Basically Game of Thrones.
I was watching an episode of Game of Thrones, and I really thought that Ramsay was based on him. I mean, maybe it's just because I was reading so much about Dracula at the time, but it was like, man, these guys would have had a lot to talk about.
But this was common practice, right? I mean,
not on his scale.
Not on his scale. Okay.
No. No, I'm not at all saying that some of the people that he opposed weren't also brutal, but in sheer number of people he had executed in a relatively brief number of time, it's between 40 and 100,000. And it's really quite extraordinary how many people he killed, often under really unprovoked or, just serious overreaction to whatever infraction he perceived. And of course, the Forest of the Impaled was something that no one had ever done.
Okay, Forest of the Impaled. You're gonna have to give some background.
That was total bait. I was hoping. So how about I just kind of dive into his life, and you guys just ask questions as it comes up.
I think that's perfect.
Okay, so he was born in Transylvania, but he is not Transylvanian as everybody sort of thinks. Transylvania was, for the most part, at the time, a fiefdom of Hungary, and his father was he had been recognized as the official prince of their homeland of Wallachia, but the Hungarian king wouldn't let him actually take command of Wallachia because he didn't want to rock the boat. So he said, okay, you just rule Transylvania as a sort of military governor, protecting my borders for a while, and then you'll take your homeland when your brother dies. So while his father was ruling Transylvania, he was born there, and so he received an early Catholic education. And then when he was about 5 years old, his father took over in Wallachia, and he went there, where they would have switched to the Orthodox education that was required of anybody who was ruling Wallachia. And then I put in the Google Doc that it's always a balance between making Hungary happy and making the Ottoman Empire happy. Whoever is ruling Wallachia, they're surrounded on all sides by one of these two powers. So Dracula's father had not done a good job of making the Sultan happy, and he and his two youngest sons were summoned. They were captured, and they were brought to Adrianople. Vlad was eventually released, his father, but Dracula and his younger brother were brought up in Sultan Murad's, like, the royal court as hostages. Again, Game of Thrones style, the way John Aaron fostered Robert and Ed Stark. The Sultan was sort of fostering, but also having hostages of Dracula's sons, or Vlad Dracul's sons, Dracula. And Dracula came to hate the Turks. He also probably learned the impalement method from them, because that was in very common use in the Ottoman Empire. But his younger brother was very popular there. He was called Radu the Beautiful, and the sources suggest that he was taken as a lover by both the Sultan and the Sultan's son, the Crown Prince Mehmet. And Mehmet and Vlad and Radu, they studied together. So Dracula had a really good education by this point, because he had studied with clerics and scholars from Orthodox, Catholic, and now Muslim teachers. He was more or less fluent in Turkish. He had studied the Quran. And he gained enough respect from the Sultan, even though he was always an unpleasant person at court, that he was made an officer in the Ottoman Empire. He seems to have even seen some service, but I don't know when. And then in 1447, his father was murdered in a coup. Their cousins, the Daneshti, who they've been feuding with, one of them had organized a coup, and his name was Vladislav II. And the father seems to have been literally stabbed in the back. His men betrayed him and killed him, and his brother, who was kind of co-ruling with his father, his elder brother, Mirza, was buried alive. And Dracula never forgot what was done to them. He had Turkish support to take back his homeland in 1448, but he only ruled for a few months before the Turks left, and without any military support, he had to leave or be killed. And this is just sort of important for the timeline. In 1453, Mehmet, who Dracula grew up with, who is now the Sultan, conquers Constantinople. And Radu, who is now Radu Dracula, because Dracula just means son of Dracul. So Vlad Dracul was the father. Vlad Dracula is the Dracula we know, but his younger brother is also a Dracula. Radu Dracula is serving alongside the Sultan Mehmed when Constantinople falls. Then in 1456, Dracula, who has been basically running around Eastern Europe trying not to get killed, makes his peace with some Hungarian rulers, and in a year when Halley's Comet is seen above them, Dracula kills Vladislav II in personal combat. And he takes over as the Prince of Wallachia. And in the next year, he starts a lifetime of atrocities. In 1457, he begins raids into Transylvania. Transylvania is primarily a Romanian population, but a lot of the most successful settlements are these German settlements that basically have legal trading monopolies from generations ago, where they were invited to colonize for economic reasons. And they are all Catholic. And they start supporting rival claimants to the throne of Wallachia. They are supporting they're basically allied with Dracula's enemies. And so he at first tries a little bit of negotiation. Then he decides to lead a personal charge with a cavalry raid, where he starts burning villages down, just about everyone. He completely razes at least 4 or 5 settlements. Most of the people he kills outright. Some of them he sends back to Târgoviște to be impaled. Târgoviște was his capital in Wallachia. Are you guys still there?
Yeah, we're
here.
just listening. I know nothing about this kind of real history or even this area of the world. So I'm just enjoying listening to you talk about this.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to make sure that we hadn't lost the connection. I was like, oh my God, I've been talking for a long time.
No,
we're
fine.
still here.
This is the part where Dracula gets really sort of interesting, where he gets the reputation that eventually leads to Bram Stoker, because survivors of some of these Catholic atrocities, they wound up in other Catholic settlements, in other monasteries and things like that. And it's from there that a lot of these original stories get recounted as horror stories. And that leads to the German pamphlets that are several generations precursors to the Penny Dreadfuls. And if you've ever seen those really gruesome woodcuts of Dracula sitting at a table with impaled people, hanging out around him, that's from those pamphlets. And the pamphlets tended to exaggerate what actually happened, but because what they were reporting was so gruesome, and because there are multiple sources, we can sort of pick through that and find out what he actually did that was, versus what is just made up to be a fun sort of campfire story. And he seems to have... Wallachia never had that sort of autocratic ruler. They didn't have primogeniture, but Dracula had really latched on to the divine right of kings thing. And he was really intent on implementing it. And so shortly after his reign begins, he gathers up the boyars, many of whom would have been involved with the coup against his father. And this is on Easter Sunday. He asks them how many princes they've served. And they went around and they gave the best answers they could, but all of them gave multiple answers. None of them could actually remember because so many princes had been usurped and replaced. And so Dracula basically said, "You have convicted yourselves." And he had all of them and their families clapped in irons. Many of them were immediately impaled and left in the court of Tirgovishte where he ruled. Others of them were force-marched off to a castle called Poinare that had fallen into ruin, but he had military plans for it. So if they were able-bodied enough, they were slave labor to rebuild this castle. He replaced a lot of the boyars that he had killed with people who were from the peasant class. And so their nobility was now completely dependent on him. So he was basically securing his power base and then riding into Transylvania on occasion to punish his enemies. One of the three rival claimants in Transylvania was the brother of Vladislav II. Vladislav II was his cousin who had arranged the murder of his father. He killed him in personal combat, like I mentioned. This figure, Dan III, he burned every village he could that had Dan III's supporters, and he even took his headquarters, but he couldn't find the man there. But he had everyone there impaled, and it was specifically described as lengthwise and crosswise. And that's kind of important because it distinguishes that Dracula did use two different methods of impalement. Because there was a specific, the preferred method was the stake was attached to horses, and the man was held in place, man or woman or child, whatever, and the horses were then sent to trot, forcing the stake up the buttocks, and occasionally it would emerge through the mouth of the victim. And supposedly the edges of the point of the stake was rounded and covered in oil so that it would push organs out of the way rather than piercing them, so that it could take several days to die. I don't know the medical truth of that, but that was the idea. And crosswise is what kind of we think of the way a vampire would be staked, like through the heart, or at least through the middle, which was considered slightly more merciful. And it was at this headquarters of Dan III where we have Dracula. There's at least one account that says he was seen dipping the bread from his meal in the blood of one of the victims. So there we have historical Dracula actually consuming the blood of another human being. Dan III then, provoked enough by Dracula burning basically all of his allies and destroying his headquarters, Dan III strikes back, loses, and Dracula has him brought to him. Dracula has a priest dressed in full funeral clothing and does the funeral liturgy to Dan III while he's still alive, before Dracula cut his head off. And that kind of ended Dracula's Transylvania campaign so that he could turn his attention towards his real enmity, which is with the Turks. He had been blowing off the tributes and things he was supposed to send them for years. And there is a story that is similar to another story, but it's entirely possible Dracula did do this sort of thing more than once, where 3 Turkish envoys came to him and he demanded they remove their hats. And being both Muslim and wearing turbans, which are not easy to remove even if it was the custom to do so, they said they couldn't, it wasn't their custom. And Dracula really, again, he liked people to condemn themselves with their own words so he could deliver some sort of twisted poetic punishment. He said, well, I want to honor your customs, so he had the turbans nailed to their heads. And so this sort of behavior was to specifically antagonize Mehmet the Conqueror, who did eventually send people to capture Dracula. One was called Hamza Pasha, and one was called Thomas Catuvelinus, who was a Greek who was a spy sent to kind of guide Dracula into an ambush. But Dracula turned the tables. He used his perfect knowledge of Turkish courtly manners to get into a fortress so that he could basically Arya Stark style open the fortress so everybody could be captured and impaled. And he saved the highest stakes for Hamza Pasha and Catuvelinus. In 1462, he takes the war to the next level. And this is Dracula's own words. I have killed men and women, old and young. We killed 23,884 Turks and Bulgars, without counting those whom we burned in homes, or whose heads were not cut by our soldiers. Thus your highness must know that I have broken the peace with him. This was a letter he sent to Matthias Corvinus, the king of Hungary, and I've broken the peace with him as with the Sultan. So I kind of like to imagine Matthias Corvinus's perspective, because he did not give Dracula permission to do this, and he was not prepared for a war with the Ottoman Empire. So not only did he receive this letter finding out that someone has basically caused a war at his doorstep, Dracula gives a very detailed list of the number of victims killed at each of the settlements along the way. Like 6,414 victims at Giurgiu, 343 at Orsovo, and stuff like that. And he sends bags of cut off noses and heads and things to Corvinus as well. He practiced germ warfare against the Ottoman Empire. Anybody he knew who was suffering from leprosy or syphilis or especially the bubonic plague, they were sent to mingle amongst the Turks and disseminate the disease. And he had switched to guerrilla tactics very early in the war because he kind of had to. But with all of these victims that he accumulated, he was constantly sending thousands of them back to Tirgovishte. Eventually, these activities did, of course, bring Mehmet the Conqueror with the largest army that he had assembled since Constantinople fell. And they unsuccessfully followed Dracula around while he ran around his country. It was during this time that the story occurred that one of Dracula's concubines, or if you believe the legend, his wife, there's different versions, but either she was shot by an arrow that was meant to warn Dracula, or she was shot by an arrow from a Turk, or she received word that Dracula was dead. But in something, she died falling out of the window. That's the opening scene of Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula, where she's committing suicide. That would have occurred while Dracula was running around to different fortresses in his guerrilla war with the Turks. And then he led a personal night attack into the actual Ottoman Turkish camp, and he almost killed the Sultan, but they mistook one of the vizier's sultans for the actual sultan's tent, and by that point the alarm had been raised and the Sultan was surrounded by bodyguards. But Dracula got away again, and as Mehmet and his company marched towards Tirgovishte looking for Dracula, 27 leagues north of the city, this forest of the impaled begins. And this is where all of these Turkish victims had wound up. So there were 20,000 plus Turks and other human beings impaled in a forest before this city. And Mehmet was so disheartened by the whole thing that he abandoned the campaign. And it was continued by Radu. And so Dracula and Radu were kind of skirmishing for a little bit. Radu lost both of the battles, but he kind of won with diplomacy what they couldn't win by fighting Dracula. By this point, everyone was just tired of the bloodshed. And, Dracula was so brutal with the way he enforced everything in rule that he had lost a lot of support. And so Radu basically was able to step in for Dracula because he was already a member of the royal family of Wallachia. It wasn't that big a deal. And he was completely in the Sultan's pocket. And Dracula was arrested on trumped-up charges which is ridiculous, of supporting the Sultan. But it was basically because the Kingdom of Hungary, they were tired of him too. They couldn't have a loose cannon like him running around. So he was kept as a political prisoner, a very well-respected and high-ranking political prisoner in the Kingdom of Hungary for years. And that's kind of where Dracula's story, as far as the interesting parts, kind of end. He briefly was allowed to return to power in 1476. He had a few more battles against the Turks, but he was assassinated by a Turkish agent amongst his own men, kind of similar to the way his father was killed. And his head was brought to the Sultan in Constantinople, preserved in a jar of honey, because they really wanted to be sure he was dead. That's all I got.
One thing that really stands out to me as you were going through that history, which thank you for going through that, because that was a lot of research that went into that. But
well, I've done the research for other things, so it was easy for me to just I'll just take this out of my other notes and tell them.
Yeah, well, I very much appreciate it. But one thing that really struck me is, of course, most people, when they look into this story, they do it because of the connection to Bram Stoker's Dracula. And they're just looking to see, here's this guy in history who did these horrible things. And I noticed it's the same thing, because I don't know as much about Vlad as I do about a character like Elizabeth Bathory, who was a little bit later, but, kind of the same time period.
I think you'll appreciate this. I'll just interject, please excuse me, but just since you like Elizabeth Bathory, Dracula knew her great uncle.
Right.
Yes. He was a supporter of Dracula's. They were basically part of the Hungarian coalition against the Turks during Dracula's brief third reign.
I knew they had a connection. I wasn't quite sure how. So again, thank you for that. But yeah, most people, if they look into her story or they look into this story, they want the blood and guts and gore. But listening to you talk about it, I realized how important that was to what they were doing, because it's such a small area of the world, and to be going up against something as vast as the Ottoman Empire.
That's right.
That they all needed it.
Yeah, it was terror tactics on a massive militarized scale, and Mehmet the Conqueror blinked. I in no way condone or I'm not saying it was a good thing, but it's kind of the Voldemort thing, terrible but also great,
Well, I mean, I can't say that I blame Mehmet for blinking upon finding a forest of 20,000 impaled corpses, but yeah.
No, the stories that are told in Hungary about it are that they, and I mean, it's really easy to believe, people thought he was the devil himself at that point, because how could you not?
Well, didn't his name eventually come to mean devil in Romanian,
the thing about that is it's the dragon as synonym for devil, that's way before Dracula. And Dracul means dragon. But Vlad Dracul took the name Dracul because he joined a knightly order, the Order of the Dragon. And Dracula is son of the dragon. And not just Dracula and his brothers, but some of their descendants used it for a while too. I don't think there was any connection. You could interpret the symbolism of like the Order of the Dragon had a cross on the back of the dragon. So I don't know if you could see that as the dragon submitting to God's will. But it wasn't an overt symbolism. It came later as history kind of turned on Dracula. Because Dracula wasn't very nice to those Catholics, but because he was a big supporter of the Pope in his war against the Turks. So at least at first, the Catholic Church mourned his death. And the perception of him in different places, like in Russia, they have the tough but fair sort of attitude about Dracula. And in Romania, he is a major national symbol of heroism and like a founding father of their nation. So I see him as a monster, but it's not the way everyone in the world sees him.
Do you think that, well, obviously he's this kind of almost like a bloodthirsty monster or freedom fighter, depending upon how you look at it, but do you think that he was purposely adding a religious tinge to some of his tortures, the impaling, lengthwise and basically crosswise, depending upon which impaled body you're looking at, and the drinking of the blood? I mean, is he trying to was he trying to purposely create like abominations to terrify people?
I don't think that, but certainly the authors of that book I mentioned, The Many Faces of Dracula, they suggest that he had it is a fact that he set up torture chambers in at least one monastery. He had his religion and his torture all mixed up, and a lot of his cruelties, like a lot of his, his petty judgments, not his big wars, but when he was enacting really cruel punishments on the small people, it was often against women, and he was very cruel to women for not being what he thought were proper women. So there is even a suggestion of possible impotence or some sort of other sexual hang-ups there. But I don't think he was specifically associating, because there was only the one incident and the possibility of him like eating the blood of his enemies. He did force other people into cannibalism on at least one occasion. There was a gypsy leader who said that impalement was against their law, and so he had the man boiled in a pot and his flesh fed to his people. I don't think that it doesn't seem to have been a common practice with him. I will say, though, he did see himself as some sort of Solomon figure. I feel like that's pretty clear with the weird word games he played with people. And, some people actually managed to give him a good enough answer that he didn't kill them. He once presented an envoy with a golden stake, and he said, "This is for you." And the man said, this was a really well-trained diplomat. He must have been aware of Dracula's hang-ups. And he said, "Well, you're a just ruler, so if you impale me, I deserve it." And Dracula was like, "You're very good, but make sure they don't send me anybody less well-trained than you." And he was fine. There was a man who was robbed of 20 ducats, and he went to Dracula, and Dracula said, "You will have your money returned to you." He warned the town that everyone in the town would be killed if the thief wasn't found. So immediately the thief was found and turned over. And the man found 21 ducats in his, wherever he kept his money. And he told Dracula about the extra ducat. And he said, "It's good that you told me, because if you had not told me about the extra ducat, you would have joined the thief on the stake." So on a few occasions, people gave the right answer, and Dracula was pleased enough to let them go. On the other answer, on other times, he found ways to get them to condemn themselves. But I think he liked this idea of the wise judge dispensing life and death justice.
And then if you think about Dracula, other myths about Dracula and how it ends up in Bram Stoker's book, the vampire, you have to invite the vampire in or accept the vampire's invitation. You have Dracula, the historical would basically say, like, you're the one who's going to condemn yourself, not me. It's twisted, but it's like, it's your fault in a way.
I guess so. Yeah, definitely. You're naming your own execution method, and you don't even know it. I think probably what ties Dracula so much to the fictional Dracula is just his association with blood. He spilled so much blood, and in Hungary, the forest of the impaled I mentioned is sometimes called the Forest of Blood. He and his brother were supposedly called the Blood Brothers by the Turks because they hated each other so much. And they actually went to battle there at the end. Although I don't think Radu ever had the fortitude to meet Dracula in battle. It's hard not to see Dracula as impressive because he was very brave and he was a very capable warrior. I just don't want to step into the realm of he was awesome when he was clearly some sort of sadist.
Kind of speaking to that a little bit, because there is so much mythology surrounding Vlad. This whole idea of a blood forest, and as you said, just that connection to blood and torture and death, and the 20,000 men or people, I guess, in the forest. And I wonder, because when I kind of have to connect it to Elizabeth Bathory a little bit because that's more of what I know. But when I read her stories or stories about her, I always wonder how much of what was attributed to her, I think they said she killed something like 650 girls. And
yeah, it was over 600 that she was convicted of. I know.
Well, that she was convicted of, and that to me has always been the problem, because the men convicting her stood to gain a lot of wealth if she was convicted. And so I wonder how much of that was trumped up as far as, trying to figure out, well, okay, did she do this but on a smaller scale, or did she do this as they said, or did they just, kind of make up the whole thing? And I don't think that obviously with this Vlad the Impaler, because there was a lot of, as you said, this kind of underground terrorist warfare going on,
right,
and creating fear. But then you hear numbers like 20,000. do you think it was actually that, or that the stories got spread?
Well, I mean,
that's what it was.
The 20,000, like, that's easy to believe because Dracula. We have like the surviving records come down to us of Dracula's letter to the King of Hungary. That's the one I read where we killed 23,884 people. I mean, that was Dracula's letter that he wrote. To the King of Hungary, telling the king something he did not want to hear. So it's actually pretty credible. And since that was the campaign, it's easy for him to have come up with those numbers, especially if we think about all of the other people that he had been impaling as a matter of course from the beginning of that reign. 100,000 is right out. Like I said, that's the highest estimates of the number of people he killed. But the low estimates, the really conservative ones, are 40,000. And that's pretty believable. Actually, if you read the book, you just realize, or really any books on the subject, they're very, it's kind of matter of fact, all these villages and stuff that he just burned, or 600 people here, seize them and impale them, boil the rest in a big pot. There's a lot of corroborating evidence of it. Well, because he didn't seem to be ashamed of it, unlike Elizabeth Bathory, who the crimes she was accused of were more hidden crimes.
Oh, no doubt. I wonder, if I was somebody like Vlad, if I'm putting myself in that position and I'm wanting to scare and intimidate, okay, so I go out and I burn these villages, but whereas maybe I got, 200 people, I'm going to tell everybody I got 800 people. You know what I mean? I'm going to exaggerate those numbers. And so in the letters that I write to people, I'm going to exaggerate to make myself seem bigger than I actually am, to seem more powerful than I actually am. That I think is more of what I question, not, if that makes sense.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's entirely possible, but he definitely, we can be sure of thousands. And certain things that have a lot of corroborating evidence from different sources, like the Forest of the Impaled, stuff like that, it really does give you pause. Even Ivan the Terrible didn't have these levels of cruelty and mass execution. It's why he stands out so much.
I was just going to make some sort of snarky comment about Vlad being what happens when the serial killer is actually in charge and doesn't, like you said, doesn't have to feel shame and hide the crimes and displays them openly.
Okay.
Well, I think that's actually a great comment because I think that's what happened.
Okay. I don't know much about this, and I don't know if you went this far, I guess, into history, but, after his reign, or his reigns, because I guess he kind of took over several times.
Only the middle one was significant.
Okay. Well, is it true then that he kind of became a local hero and continue, because they still, so. I'm curious to wonder why.
Okay. Well, it's a similar phenomenon in Russia. Even today, Stalin is very popular in Russia because the respect for strength is so great. Dracula is also a very important figure in kind of unifying the Romanian people. He fortified Bucharest, which was just interconnected towns. And so he kind of serves as one of the people that founded the Romanian nation as it came to exist later. He was adopted, for better and worse, by the Romanian nationalist movement. But he really did, in his own way, care about protecting Wallachia. And though many of his victims were Romanians, most Romanians respected the fact that he killed people from all walks of life. And, you know, if you didn't live in Târgoviște, you probably wouldn't you probably wouldn't see him on a regular basis, but you would hear things like he's getting rid of all the criminals. What that means is that he's gathered together all the beggars in a house and he's lit it on fire. But his fight against the Ottoman Turks was something they wanted, and he was protecting Wallachia from them, especially the practice of recruiting 500 boys into their Janissary Corps, which is kind of a way to assimilate a culture slowly over time. So I can see why, and as I said, he is very impressive figure. So if you're going for that old world idea of hero, not so much as somebody that does good works, but was really good at fighting and really impressive, he is that. If you do a Google search, I'm sorry.
No, I'm just, I mean, when you put it that way too, it's just, you know, not just that he had this tremendous strength and was incredibly good at fighting and warfare, but that he essentially founded their country as it is. But
he's become that figure over time because he did contribute to it.
I think one thing that we're trying to do is to separate what people think they know about Vlad the Impaler, who then became Bram Stoker's Dracula, with the actual historical figure.
Well, you know, like I love Bram Stoker's Dracula, but he is, even in that book, he's romanticized in a way that maybe he shouldn't be. You know, I don't. Yeah. He's kind of seen as this tragic figure who lost his love, and now he's got this curse. It's like, well, that's only if you don't think of the Ottoman Turks as people, which they certainly were. And, you know, these people he was killing, they were just people. They weren't soldiers, not most of them. They were just people who were part of the Ottoman Empire, and therefore, for Dracula, a legitimate target.
Did you want to talk all about how you're adapting this, like in the work you're doing? I know it's probably still nascent, but
yeah, I'm writing a blank verse history of Dracula in the vein of like one of Shakespeare's histories. But I'm adding vampires because I'm not going to write, you know, a Dracula play and not put vampires in it. I'm just not doing it.
I think you would have riots in the audience if you didn't include the vampires.
That's kind of what I thought too. Like I think I can do it in such a way as to actually tell some of the history as well, and not just have people like, I did not sit through all that Shakespeare bullshit, and to not get a vampire when Dracula's on this play.
You know, something you said though, you know, talking about, I guess, kind of fictionalizing the history, because people have tried in the past to look at the historical figure of Vlad that became, you know, Dracula. And I'm thinking of that movie that came out a few years ago.
Dracula Untold.
Yes. But where you even brought it up, this idea of like how Bram Stoker had kind of romanticized his monster, his creature, character, whatever you want to call him. And that is another very romanticized tale. You know, somebody who has to become monster to save everybody. And to me, this story is much more interesting than that version.
I think that Dracula Untold was a little bit too easy on him. No, it was a lot too easy on him. He was just a good guy who eventually becomes a vampire to protect his people, but he's never even a brutal good guy until that point. There's a Romanian film, I think it's called Vlad the Impaler, but he's at least a very strict, brutal good guy in that movie, even though they too whitewash a lot of the things he did to paint him in the best possible light. But that is still a far more accurate portrayal than Dracula Untold. I know Dracula Untold's a fantasy horror film, so I'm not holding it to the same standard, but it does entirely villainize the Ottoman Turks and entirely deify Dracula, which I think we should be past.
I mean, I don't really have anything to wrap it up other than just saying, like, that was really cool history lesson there on Vlad the Impaler, because, I mean, like you asked at the beginning, what we know, and obviously not very much, but man, thanks for coming on and being part of this, because that was really cool.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciated it.
And definitely, whenever you do down the road finish writing this this blank verse Shakespearean history of Dracula, definitely let us know, and we will be sure to promote it and let people know about it. We just want to say thank you again to Paul Jannise for being a co-host here on this episode of the No Fear Cast. And we just also want to remind you that if you want to support us, please consider supporting us financially on Patreon. For as little as $5 a month, you can unlock exclusive mini episodes that are only for our Patreon supporters. But if you're not in a position where you are able to financially support us, please at least rate or review us on iTunes. Those ratings really do make a big difference in terms of new people finding this show. So thank you again, and we will see you next time.